welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Catherine of Aragon. Thomas Wolsey still thought France was the best way to go for an alliance. Immediately after the Emperor Charles departed, Catherine accompanied Henry to France on a celebrated visit to Francois I and the Field of Cloth of Gold. The Field of Cloth of Gold was a peace summit between England and France. The king's head advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, was attempting to get peace, along with another one of the king's advisors, Thomas More. Thomas More was a humanist. He believed in peace and human rights. For the Catholics, that is, because if you weren't Catholic, Thomas More had no time for you. But a peaceful Catholic world, that is what he was going for. I don't know exactly what it looked like, but my favorite depiction is in the Showtime show The Tudors. Tents that looked like castles, wine fountains, and the King of France wrestling with the King of England, who at the time were both young, tall, and strong. They were attractive and both trying to show off. This may have been where the king met Anne Boleyn. Anne's sister had been the French king's mistress when she had been in France, but for the last year she had been lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She probably accompanied them to France. Queen Catherine had been known for being strict with her ladies. This would have been hard for Mary Boleyn. Just a year ago, she was the mistress of a king at a progressive court. But Anne, her sister, was still at French court, so she had a friendly face, and the king took notice of Mary Boleyn. Maybe hearing she had been the French king's mistress, he decided to pay her extra attention. A peace treaty with France was established, with Princess Mary being betrothed to the Dauphin of France, because the best way you can make an alliance is to marry your children together. Everyone knew that. It had worked so well in the past. And if it worked this time, England and France, as one country, would be united. And that would solve the problem of Mary being female. They could unite England and France. Mary and her French husband would likely run both countries together, and their first son would inherit both thrones. But the betrothal didn't last long. Within 2 years, the war was declared against France, and the Holy Roman Emperor was once again welcome in England. He was back in, where plans were afoot to betroth him to Catherine's daughter, Princess Mary. Princess Mary was 6, and Charles V was 22, and remember that whole first cousin inbred thing. Ew. Her ex-betrothed, Francis, was only 4. Moving on. I don't know. They knew better. I'm just saying. It's not that they didn't know that it was a problem. You couldn't marry your cousin in England in the 16th century. Everybody knew that was a bad idea. But kings could get permission from the Pope to break the law. That's the only difference. They knew better. Anyway, moving on. I'm sorry. Not long after having his baby, Henry Fitzroy, with his mistress, King Henry was moving on, because that's what he did. He was showing interest in his wife's lady-in-waiting, Mary Boleyn. During this time, King Henry had found Mary Boleyn a husband, and a husband that didn't mind sharing his wife with the king. And if she ended up pregnant by the king, Mary's husband and Henry's friend would claim them. And she did, twice. Once in 24 and once in 26. We don't know who their father was, because she had a husband and a boyfriend. But legally, not the king. Even though her son was named Henry after her boyfriend. But a lot of babies were named after the king. That wasn't unusual. The king probably assumed that they weren't his, because they weren't his problem. They had a father at home. Henry moved on to another mistress in any case. While Mary was busy having babies, Henry got acquainted with her sister, Anne, now also a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Henry had a type. Elizabeth Blount, Mary Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn had all been ladies-in-waiting for his wife. Gross. He liked a sizable power difference in his relationships. But I guess when you are the king, there's bound to be a power difference in every relationship. There were probably many more mistresses. These three are the first ones we took notice of because the first two may have had his babies, and the third one was about to. Henry seemed to really enjoy knocking up his mistresses. I think it made him feel better about Catherine losing her babies. He thought it proved it wasn't God's judgment of him. It was God's judgment with his wife, because he could knock people up just fine. Henry still thought of his daughter not as his heir, but as a political alliance tool. He may have been trying to help her. If we give him the benefit of the doubt, she would likely be allowed to be queen and ruler of England if she had a king or an emperor as a husband. The bigger the army, the better. And if she couldn't hold on to it, then she would have another country to be safe in and queen of. Catherine wanted her to be queen, but if she had to marry a foreign prince, Catherine just hoped it wouldn't be a French prince. It was the whole France, they did not get along. Henry's new love interest was someone familiar, Anne Boleyn. If you know who she is, I don't need to say it. And if you don't know, there's way too much to say now. But she'll be the next episode, so you won't have to wait long. In 1525, it was clear that the 40-year-old queen was not having any more children. Her daughter, Princess Mary, was 9 years old and still an only child. King Henry was 35 and very much still wanted a male heir. King Henry began pursuing Anne aggressively. Henry began to believe that his marriage was cursed and sought confirmation from the Bible, which he interpreted to say that if a man marries his brother's wife, the couple will be childless. They did have a daughter, so they weren't childless, but Henry said girls didn't count. Whatever, guy. #I roll. Even if her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated, Catherine would insist her dying day that she had come to Henry's bed a virgin. Henry's interpretation of that biblical passage meant that their marriage had been wrong in the eyes of God from day one. But this is the exact matter that had already been decided when Henry was 13 and Catherine was 18. Whether the Pope at the time of Henry and Catherine's marriage had the right to overrule Henry's claimed spiritual impediment, it would become a hot topic in Henry's campaign to get an annulment from the Pope. It is possible that the idea of an annulment had been suggested to Henry much earlier than this, and it is probable that it was motivated by his desire for a son. But in order for any new heir to be legitimate and fit to be king, his first marriage would have to be annulled. Henry had been educated in religion until he became the heir, so he saw himself as quite the spiritual authority. He had become the heir at 10, though, so I'm sure his education was great, but my guy changed majors to poli-sci in the 4th grade, so I don't know how much he retained. It soon became the one absorbing object of Henry's desires, to secure an annulment at all cost. Catherine was defiant when it was suggested that she retire to a nunnery, saying, "God never called me to a nunnery. I am the king's true and legitimate wife." He set his hopes upon an appeal to the Pope, acting independently of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, whom he told nothing of his plans. The king's secretary was sent to Pope Clement VII to sue for annulment on the grounds that the papal dispensation of Pope Julius II was obtained by false pretenses. He said Catherine had lied and fooled the Pope. Catherine argued that she hadn't lied, and their daughter was proof that God agreed with her. Unfortunately for Henry, the Pope was, at that time, the prisoner of Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, following the sack of Rome in May 1527. King Henry's secretary had difficulty in obtaining access to him. In the end, Henry's envoy had to return without accomplishing much. Henry now had no choice but to put the great matter into the hands of Wolsey, who did all he could do to secure a decision in Henry's favor. His life depended on it. Both the Pope and Martin Luther raised the possibility that Henry have 2 wives, not to reintroduce polygamy generally. They were still against that, but to preserve the royal dignity of Catherine and Mary. Basically, pretend Catherine had died and Henry had moved on to a second marriage. Only she wasn't dead. She would just be a nun. Henry then decided it was time to tell his wife he was leaving her. Catherine, sobbing, begged him not to leave her. Henry then comforted her and told her it would all work out for the best, but BT dubs, he's still leaving. He was not emotionally mature. Crying wives were very hard for him, but at least he spoke to her, and that was not a courtesy his other 5 wives were afforded. Catherine claimed that in Spain there was her official papal legate that proved that her marriage was legal, then and now. King Henry made Catherine write a letter to her nephew, the now King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, asking for the papal legate. It was to be taken by her English chaplain to the King of Spain. But Catherine didn't trust her English chaplain, so she also sent one of her Spanish servants with a verbal warning not to hand over the legate because Henry would just destroy it. Her Spanish servant was detained by the English. Catherine's chaplain, being English, was allowed to continue. He arrived in Spain early and not only delivered the letter, but also delivered Catherine's verbal message, warning him against it. He was loyal to Catherine after all. King Charles said the English could see it, but the paperwork was staying in Spain. Wolsey went so far as to convene an ecclesiastical court in England with a representative of the Pope presiding, and Henry and Catherine herself were in attendance. Catherine testified like she had at the trial, when she was a teenager trying to prove she was a virgin. I won't read the whole thing, it's long and in Old English, but I will summarize it because it's pretty cool. She's cool. So, to set the scene, they're in some kind of religious trial with bishops and priests there to preside over this trial and make a ruling. Catherine walked over to her husband. She left where she would normally testify and walked over to her husband of, at this point, 20 years, and the father of her only child, Mary, and dramatically fell to her knees. Then she testified straight to his face, basically on her knees in front of him. The short version is, dude, we've been married and in love for 20 years. Please don't do this. I'm from Spain and I'm alone here. And these are all your people. And I'm begging you, as the king, don't do this. Before God and the whole world, you are the only guy ever banged. And also, I've always done everything you've ever asked. I've loved your loved ones, not because I had any reason to, but because you love them. Remember that baby you had with Elizabeth Blount? I was so cool about that. Not to mention when you slept with your girlfriend Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary. I was totes cool with them too. We had 6 kids, but God took 5 of them earlier than I would have liked. It wasn't my fault. I did what I was supposed to do. I was a virgin when we got married, and that's a decision you are going to have to live with if you insist on doing this. Dismiss these charges, but if you don't, I'm going to leave it in God's hands. Hashtag Jesus take the wheel. Then she stood up and she walked out of court, followed by her ladies. They called her back as she was leaving, but she refused. She just kept on walking right out of court. She never returned to court. She just stayed at home and trusted that God would be on her side and everything would be okay. The Pope had no intention of allowing a decision to be reached in England, and his legate was recalled. How far was the Pope influenced by Charles V? It's difficult to say. But it is clear Henry saw that the Pope was unlikely to annul his marriage to the Emperor's aunt. The Pope forbade Henry to marry again before a decision was given in Rome. He was like, you can wait. We'll let you know. But right now you're still married to that lady. Wolsey had failed, and he was dismissed from public office in 1529. Wolsey then began a secret plot to have Anne Boleyn forced into exile and began communicating with the Pope to that end. When this was discovered, Henry ordered Wolsey's arrest, and, had he not already been terminally ill and died in 1530, he probably would have been executed for treason. Anne and Wolsey had been at odds for some time, and they wanted each other gone. And now Wolsey was. Thomas More, the humanist, became the new chancellor. He was torn because he loved the king, but he was devoutly Catholic and did not want the king to divorce Queen Catherine. Enter Thomas Cromwell. Everyone is named Thomas. Thomas Wolsey, Thomas Moore, Thomas Cromwell, all Thomases. Thomas Cromwell had worked for Wolsey, but now that he saw how that went, he didn't really want to go the same way. So Cromwell decided that what the king wanted, the king would get. And what the king wanted was Anne Boleyn. A year later, Catherine was banished from court, and her old rooms were given to Anne Boleyn. For 6 years, Queen Catherine had lived at court with her husband and his mistress. At first, she didn't take it very seriously. Henry had lots of relationships over the years, lots of mistresses. But this one seemed more serious. Catherine wrote in a letter to Charles V, her nephew, in 1531. My tribulations are so great, my life so disturbed by the plans daily invented to further the king's wicked intention. The surprises which the king gives me with certain persons of his council are so mortal, and my treatment is what God knows. That is enough to shorten 10 lives, much more mine. Henry was not about to give up. He sent a delegation of 30 men to argue to Catherine that the marriage was not valid. They showed up at night, all intimidating. 30 men show up at your house at night to tell you why you're not really married. Catherine rebutted the entire argument. She then mocked the men, saying she was astonished to see so many figures around her at such an hour. Like, oh my, this seems like a bit of an overreaction, don't you think, gentlemen? The Duke of Norfolk, the uncle of Henry's mistress Anne, remarked, "It's wonderful to see her courage. Nothing seems to frighten her," because frightening her was the whole point of sending 30 men to her house in the middle of the night. I can't with that man. When Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, died, the Boleyn's family chaplain, Thomas Cranmer, was appointed to the vacant position. Another Thomas. Now we have Cranmer. It was then that King Henry decided maybe he wasn't Catholic after all. And as king, maybe he was head bitch in charge. Why should he listen to the Pope? He was now a member of a religion he created called the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Think Catholicism minus the Pope, plus allowed divorce sometimes, especially if you're the king. Now it was just up to King Henry, the head of the Church of England, and he decided that yes, he was owed an annulment. Did he want one? Yes. Did he get one? Yes. Problem solved. But they would need a trial to decide for sure, just to make it legal in England. When Henry decided to annul his marriage to Catherine, John Fisher became her most trusted counselor and one of her chief supporters. He appeared in the legate's court on her behalf, where he shocked people with the directness of his language, and by declaring that, like John the Baptist, he was ready to die on behalf of the indissolubility of marriage. Henry was so enraged by this that he wrote a long Latin address to the legates in answer to Fisher's speech, like a whole long Latin thing. Fisher's copy of this still exists, with his manuscript annotations in the margins, which show how little he feared Henry's anger. The removal of the cause to Rome ended Fisher's role in the matter, but Henry never forgave him for that. Other people who supported Catherine's case, she had a lot of supporters, include Henry's own sister, Mary Tudor, Queen of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, her nephew, Charles V, Pope Paul III, and Protestant reformers Martin Luther and William Tyndale. She had the Protestants and the Catholics on her side. After the annulment, she was quoted, "I would rather be a poor beggar's wife and be sure of heaven than queen of all the world and stand in doubt thereof by reason of my own consent." She's like, you know what? Choices were made and I can live with it. I can sleep at night. Upon returning to Dover from a meeting with King Francois of France in Calais, Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony. Some sources speculate that Anne was already pregnant at the time, and Henry did not want to risk a son being born illegitimate. But others testify that Anne, who had seen her sister Mary Boleyn taken up as the king's mistress and summarily cast aside, refused to sleep with Henry until they were married. Henry defended the lawfulness of their union by pointing out that Catherine had previously been married. If she and Arthur had consummated their marriage, Henry, by canon law, had the right to remarry. On the 23rd of May, 1533, Cranmer, sitting in judgment at the special court, convened to rule on the validity of Henry's marriage to Catherine, declared the marriage unlawful, even though Catherine had testified that she and Arthur had never had physical relations. 5 days later, on the 28th of May, 1533, Cranmer ruled that Henry and Anne's marriage was valid. It screamed show trial. They were always going to rule in favor of the king, and by this point, Anne Boleyn was definitely pregnant. She would have her baby just 4 months later, a girl they named Princess Elizabeth. And, spoiler alert, just like her sister Mary, Elizabeth would also become Queen Regnant of England, the second one. For a man that was sure he needed sons, he had 2 daughters that became Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I. The Acts of Supremacy and Succession were on the scene in 1534. They had to be signed by anyone in England of any significance. The Acts of Succession named Henry VIII head of the Church of England and Princess Mary retroactively illegitimate. She was no longer Princess Mary. She was Lady Mary. Thomas More and Bishop Fisher refused to sign, along with Queen Catherine. More and Fisher were executed for it. Catherine requested that if she was to be executed, she wanted it to be done in public. If Henry's home life is getting confusing, here is where he is. He is a 42-year-old king. He has a 47-year-old ex-wife, the former Queen Catherine. With his former wife, he has a 17-year-old daughter, the former Princess Mary. He also has a new wife, 32-year-old Anne Boleyn, former lady-in-waiting to his first wife, and together they have a new baby, Princess Elizabeth. Until the end of her life, Catherine would refer to herself as Henry's only lawful wedded wife and England's only rightful queen. And her servants continued to address her as such as well. Henry refused to give her the right to any title except Dowager Princess of Wales. She was legally back to being his widowed sister-in-law instead of his wife and the mother of his daughter. So King Henry was a great husband until he really, really wasn't. And Princess Mary, at 17, was no longer the heir to the throne and no longer a princess. She was demoted to a lady and the illegitimate daughter of the king. So Henry was also a pretty great father until he really, really wasn't. The new heir was the baby Princess Elizabeth. This was a pretty big blow to Mary. Her father had passed laws to legally say that he preferred his younger daughter to his older daughter. It wasn't a pattern yet, but it will become one. Henry's love for his children seems directly related to his feelings for their mothers at any given time. And his feelings for their mothers seem to be based on how well they could have children. And the more boys, the better. Catherine said that even if she lost, she would shout so loudly from the bottom of hell that God would still hear her. Catherine went to live at various castles, starting with the Moore Castle in Hertfordshire, late 1531, and ending at Kimbolton Castle, Cambridgeshire, where she confined herself to one room, which she only left to attend Mass, dressed in the hair shirt of the Order of St. Francis of Assisi, and fasted continuously. She was on a hunger strike and calling it a religious fast. She did have a history of this, though. She had great faith in the power of fasting, and she would go overboard often, sometimes nearly starving herself, just as her mother had done. When she was permitted to receive occasional visitors, she was forbidden to see her daughter Mary. They were also forbidden to communicate in writing, but sympathizers discreetly conveyed the letters between the two. Henry offered both mother and daughter better quarters and permission to see each other if they would just acknowledge Anne Boleyn as next. She was the queen. Just say she's the queen. Say she's the queen and we can make it all better. But they both refused. In late December 1535, sensing her death was near, Catherine made her will, and wrote to her nephew, the Emperor Charles V, asking him to protect her daughter, Princess Mary. It has been claimed that she then penned one final letter to Henry. Here's the summary. My most dear Lord, King, and husband, in that order. I'm dying soon. I still love you, so I'm writing this letter. I'll pray for your soul. That's the best gift I could give to you. You should care more about your soul than you do about your dick, but clearly you and your dick have caused a lot of problems. I forgive you, and I pray that God can also forgive you. Please be a good dad to Mary, find husbands for my ladies, and pay my servants. Last, I just want you to know you're the only thing I want to see before I die. Love, Catherine, the Queen, your wife, in that order. The authenticity of the letter itself has been questioned, but not Catherine's attitude in its wording, which has been reported with variations in different sources. That seems to be exactly how she felt. She did, at the end of her life, question if she had done the right thing, feeling that her refusing an annulment may have caused a schism between the Pope and England. But I think it's clear that it was Henry's fault. King Henry sent people to Catherine, hoping to have her admit she lied on her deathbed and return him to the good guy status he missed so much. Catherine did not admit she lied. She insisted that she had always been telling the truth. Catherine died at Kimbolton Castle on the 7th of January, 1536, at the age of 50. The following day, news of her death reached the king. At this time, there were rumors that she was poisoned because her heart was black, but cancer looked a lot like poison, and they didn't know about cancer then, so I don't know. According to the chronicler Edward Hall, Anne Boleyn wore yellow for the mourning, which has been interpreted in various ways. Some interpreted this to mean that Anne did not mourn. She was dressed in yellow. Catherine was dead and she was happy. Chapuis reported that it was King Henry who decked himself in yellow, celebrating the news and making a great show of his and Anne's daughter Elizabeth to his courtiers. This was seen as distasteful and vulgar by many. His daughter, Princess Mary, now 17, had been neglected and demoted from Princess Mary to Lady Mary. Another theory is that dressing yellow was out of respect for Catherine, as yellow was said to be the Spanish color of mourning, but also maybe it wasn't the Spanish color of mourning. I've heard both, so I don't know. If I'm honest, Henry and Anne didn't seem too broken up over her death. Certainly, later in the day, it's reported that Henry and Anne, both individually and privately, wept for her death. But that has damage control vibes all over it to me. Mary now worked in the household of her little sister Elizabeth as lady-in-waiting. On the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne Boleyn miscarried the baby she was carrying, a male child. This would have been seen as a very bad omen and was the beginning of the end of their marriage. Catherine was given a funeral of a dowager princess of Wales, not as a queen. Henry did not attend the funeral, and he forbade his daughter Mary to attend. And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Catherine of Aragon? She's kind of a badass, and she fought the establishment, and one could say she lost, but I think she was strong, outspoken, and intelligent when those were not positive traits for women. It would have been easier to cave into the king's will. She would have been able to see her daughter before she died. She could have even lived with her daughter if she wanted to. What do you think? Should she have given in to the king or held her ground? You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support it by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/longlivethequeen. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next week, bye.